well. And then towards the end, you might develop the questions and we can go from there. So, there we go. Rattlesnakes are in the genus Protolis, and that means the rattle. It's a pretty prominent appendage on the tail. You want to keep the lights on, or you can dim them a little bit, just to help us. Yeah. No, that's it, yeah. A little more, maybe. You can do it. Oh, there you go.
How's that?
I think that. One of the main researchers on rattlesnakes early on was Lawrence Glauber, published a 2-volume, 1,400-page monograph in 1956. He was an electrical engineer with San Diego Power and Light. And in the spare time, he had a hobby of rattlesnakes. He accumulated about 14,000 preserved specimens in his basement research home. And this material was all turned over to the San Diego Museum of Natural History after his death. Anybody wanting to know anything at all about rattlesnakes can look up Glauber there. It's in all the libraries. Now anybody that looks at rattlesnakes might be familiar with several different species of them, starting in the upper left. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, and up into British Columbia, Canada, you get northern Pacific rattlesnakes. If you're in Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma, you get prairie rattlesnakes. If you're in the Southwest, Arizona, Southern California, New Mexico, you get Western diamondbacks. If you're in Southeast, Georgia and Florida and Alabama, you get Eastern diamondbacks. But Harry Green has a neat statement here. No other North American vertebrates inspire fear so out of proportion to their real threat to human welfare. They really don't pose much of a threat to anyone at any time, unless you go doing things we should. Now, as far as this group as a whole, they're members of the viper family Viperidae, found in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The rattlesnakes per se are found only in the Americas. They strictly are a North American, Central American, and South American group of what we call pit vipers. Pit vipers sort of look like this: a mother and her baby. Probably a baby that only a mother could love here. But they both have an evident hole in the side of the head called pit. It's a special sensory receptor for infrared radiation or heat differences. And of course, they're venomous. So they have a fang, which is a needle-like tooth. They have a venom gland that secretes a venom, which is a complex mixture of enzymes and toxins. And of course, the whole purpose of being a venomous animal is that it's good for immobilizing or killing their prey, which they do readily with this highly evolved system of being a venomous animal. I could go into a little bit of what happens to people if they are accidentally bitten by a rattlesnake at the end of the talk, if you'd like, but that really isn't my focus here today. Now, pit vipers have attracted quite a bit of attention from biologists. This is the meeting we had 2 years ago at the Chiricahua Desert Museum, and you can see here a couple of hundred fanatical research biologists from all over the country working on pit vipers, rattlesnakes in particular, and other groups of pit vipers from all over the world: Europe, Asia, South America. And this animal that we're talking about today was described in 1758 officially by Linnaeus, Swedish botanist, who started the whole system of binomial nomenclature. So this is known scientifically as Protolis, the horrible rattling snake. And here you can see the variation that we have in our local populations. And here again, we describe morph variants in this population we have right here, within 2 miles of where we sit. And so we call these yellow morphs that you see on the left, and black morphs you see on the right. And some of them are more dramatically colored than this, but there's quite a bit of variation on yellow and black. And you can see here in the painting Audubon did 2 centuries ago, the timber rattlesnake in a tree attacking a mockingbird nest. His coloration and pattern of the snake is actually absolutely perfect. I mean, nobody could mistake that animal there for anything other than a timber rattlesnake. The open mouth and striking posture and so forth are a little bit stylized, but the paint down, that's early 19th century artistry. So I'll give a general story of the area and the snakes, so that you come away from here with a better understanding of them. I started out in Utah half a century ago, tracking snakes in the cold desert of near the Great Salt Lake, and then came to New York and discovered that I had a lot of learning to do. So my adult education on these things really began right here. And here you can see some of the problems in the press that have occurred over the years, like snake poaching dominating, and up top it's hidden there, but herpetologists believe that the poacher is lower than a snake, or eating protected species is wrong, certainly is wrong. And on the right here, you might think, well, the headline should have been rattlesnake killed in death of camper. But it's the other way around. Camper charged in death of rattlesnake actually happened, could continue to happen. And then a few things about rattlesnake. So basically, there's a lot of publicity that attends to studying animals. So I acknowledge DEC for endangered and threatened species permits, RPI up the road here for what's called an IACUC permit for handling and transporting, forest rangers, lake rangers, game wardens, and of course, the Lake George Land Conservancy, where we are right now, that I strongly support. The Park Commission, 2 local papers, the Mirror Chronicle, and of course, towns of Bolton and Hague are both active in controlling or getting nuisance rattlesnake and things show up. I want to acknowledge my wife dealing with our wonderful Adirondack guide Jenny here. And a great book, if you're interested in a regional book, it's pretty darn good. John Furman's Timber Rattlesnakes in Vermont and New York, where he covers Rutland County, Vermont, Warren and Washington and Essex counties here in northeastern New York, and talks a lot about what they do and so forth. Also, I want to acknowledge my recently deceased childhood buddy, Bill Burkhead, William S. Burkhead. He and I started our sojourns together in 7th grade, and he passed away 2 years ago, unfortunately. And Marty Martin, basically, really one of the main experts. Both of these gentlemen passed away in the same year. He was a very close friend and colleague. Here he is shown in Virginia with an adult timber rattlesnake. And this is my research associate, Matt Simon. So if you have albums with the rattlesnake and call DEC or you call the town animal control, usually it would be Matt that's on the go with it, although I'll do nuisance recovery as well. And of course, we've done an awful lot of field work in the mountain range here. Here we are on together, working together. We don't do much together now because I'm a little handicapped with joint problems. But anyway, that's biological joints. Other things. This is the first timber rattlesnake I ever saw. First one. Very first one. It was so exciting. This was a little two-year-old female. Just exactly as she was found in nature. We're fortunate enough to get a photograph of her. A little bit I know that over the years, from that point, marking and releasing these animals. This one, for example, is a 36-year capture history. And she turned out to be our longest lived timber rattlesnake that we published a paper on. Is that, can you see all this okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, good. Anyway, we estimated this snake's age at 51 years. And we published a paper on the record lifespan that they had. But 36-year capture history, however, she was 14 or 15 years old when we first marked her at that initial point. So we have good documentation of that. Now, if you look at the geographic range throughout the country, timber rattlesnakes do occur sporadically in a lot of states, but in 30 states. And our situation is in northeastern New York. Here you can see some of the actual populations. Here's one from North Carolina. Now, they're extirpated from Maine, Rhode Island, Ontario, and probably Michigan, although we're not certain of records in Michigan and Delaware. And the type locality is right there in New York City, Manhattan, where the first scientifically described timber rattlesnake was taken. That's called a type locality. It's important for taxonomy to establish this for every brand new species that gets named in the literature. New York State, they occur only in the southeastern sector of the Adirondacks, from Warren, Washington, and Essex counties, and then down in southeastern New York, primarily in the Hudson Highlands, the Shawangunk, Delaware Hills, 5 counties down there, Orange, Sullivan, Delaware, Ulster, Rockland, out in southwestern Tier, Steuben and Chemung, and here again is the type locality in New York. So that's good. Now, what I want to show you here is Mount Independence, Vermont, which is a historical site, and High Rock Spring in Saratoga. These are interesting sites. First, High Rock Spring. Today, you have a pavilion, you have a nice signage here, and an early description of rattlesnake dens being found in the ledges nearby. This is a current photograph of these outcrops here that are right on the slope of Route 50 as it goes right into Saratoga Springs. And this was visited by the Mohawk Indians and by George Washington. I think by George Washington. Doesn't it say that? I think it does in let's see, George Washington,
George
Governor Clinton, Alexander Hamilton, and Philip Schuyler in 1783 visited High Rock Spring. Of course, rattlesnakes don't occur there anymore because you notice the condominiums over there in the back. As far as Mount Independence, shown here today with the Green Mountains in the background. Now, what we have here in 1776 was Mount Independence, which was at that point called Rattlesnake Hill. And today you can see that it is completely reforested. But when the provincials and the Americans set up their defensive positions against not Markham, excuse me, going to Saratoga.
Going?
We're going, sure. There was a diversionary bridge between Mount Independence and Ticonderoga to deter Burgoyne's southern advance towards Stillwater. So this is a historical site. Of course, I think it probably pre-established. Dams were probably located here along the escarpment. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Touch the screen, you get the next slide. Okay. Now, Lake Champlain is an area where they occur. And of course, we're standing here in an area that's halfway between, or on the west side of Lake Champlain, Vermont, where we're standing, and New York on the other side here. South Bay area. And the rattlesnake here don't mind a little interstate transport or interstate transport by swimming, which they do occasionally. Of course, they're not aquatic; these are totally terrestrial mountainous snakes, but they will get out of the water sometimes and move movements. Now, in the Adirondacks, it's a 1.2 billion year old granitic dome in a 6 million acre state park known for its wilderness wildlife such as bear, moose, flatflies, and abundant rivers, lakes, and bogs. These are photographs of Carl Heilman Lake Earth scenes. Actually, the lower scene is on the mountain range right up here where timber rattlesnakes occur. It's right in rattlesnake country. Tony Hall, the great editor of our Lake George Mirror, recently wrote, with 2.6 million acres of constitutionally protected forest preserve lands in the Adirondacks, New York is better situated than most states to utilize its forests to reduce its carbon footprint. One more argument, if any more arguments are needed, in defense of wilderness and its value to us. That's a great statement by one of our local media editors, Tony Hall. So the Adirondacks, large section of them, study populations are right here. There are several extinct populations here. The village of Bolton Landing is right there with the red dot. And there are several other populations around the study area, and the northernmost population up here, but nowhere else, anywhere else in the Adirondacks. In other words, these animals, essentially in their evolutionary history, they migrated historically north from their southern refugia after the glacial retreat, and can only colonize low-lying hills and so forth along the main rivers like the Hudson and the Champlain lowlands. So they just don't occur anywhere else in the Adirondacks, only here in the southwestern eastern sector, southeastern and eastern sectors do they occur. And they'll never occur anywhere else in the Adirondacks. Even with global warming, essentially, they'll never do it. They will not be able to migrate like that, and there may not be any sufficient areas for them to den. Now, denning is what we really look for. A den is a place where a population aggregates for the winter. Here we have a couple of colleagues that are discussing the latest political arguments right on a rattlesnake den, ignoring the snakes underfoot and the rocks. And which during the winter, the snakes are presumably way down here in the crevice under the frost line in certain small groups where they hibernate. They're in total dormancy. Their body temperatures drop down to about 40 degrees, and probably heart rate runs maybe 2 a minute. Maybe they breathe, take a breath of air maybe once every 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, they're totally dormant between during the hibernation during the winter. Now, what happened then in historical terms, glacials, Wisconsin and glaciation covered the entire state 21,000 years ago. 14,000 years ago, it began to pull back north. The main drainages you see there by the blue arrows. And farther, 13,000 years ago, and then finally, about 11,000 years ago, and here's our location. We have the Lake George and Champlain drainage north. We have the Hudson Mohawk drainage south. And so it would be impossible for these snakes to have been here earlier, at least earlier than about 10,000 years ago. However, if we look at major trees like the American beech or the eastern hemlock, their total range is shown in the shaded area, but their advance following the retreat of the glaciers is shown going northward until they established a position close to where we are at 7,000 years ago for beech and at about 8,000 years ago for hemlock. So we're surmising that these rattlesnakes and maybe other species followed the glacial retreat northward and weren't able to establish colonies here earlier than about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, because those are the times when these major forest trees and other species of trees came in. Now, this is a view over a century, an 1880 view of a couple on one of our biggest den complexes. After a century, 1985, one of my colleagues standing right there, showing that these historical ancestral denning areas are essentially fixed and well known. The rattlesnakes have been there, let's say, for 8,000 years. Now, there have been other glaciations during the Pleistocene beyond this one, or earlier than this, going back a couple 100,000 years. So they came and went. And what we're talking about now is really the most recent period of their occupancy. So the period begins with fall ingress to a den and lasts about 7 months from October to April. And then in the active season, it begins with what we call emergence, spring emergence from a den, and lasts about 5 months, May through September. So these snakes are active for 5 months. The other 7 months, they're down there hibernating, out of sight and presumably out of conditions that would cause them to freeze. So we see emergence and ingress, emergence and ingress. So a particular pattern of life history runs like that. The mating season is in July and August, i.e. beginning right now. This is when male rattlesnakes are actively out there searching for a female. Females are a scarce resource because they only come into reproductive readiness after reaching maturity about every 3rd or 4th year. They don't reproduce more than 2 or 3 times during an entire average lifetime. Therefore, a particular female, only reproducing every 3rd or 4th year during her reproductive lifetime is overall a scarce resource for males. The birth pulse begins around 1st September, and that's when birthing occurs. And birthing season really is in September. We've begun to see them a little earlier in recent years, however, under climate change, beginning around even late August, and some of the babies start being born. Emergence sort of looks like this. The snakes basically come out of hibernation very carefully and slowly. They don't just rush out. They peer out and they take their time. They may come out, and when the weather gets cold at night, they go back in. They come out and come back in. So they do this over a period of time until the weather is right. Then they're out on the surface, and they're very gregarious, very social, just like humans should be. And that's a view of 7 or 8 timber rattlesnakes on a den in early spring. Quite common to see this. Well, we're lucky you can see something like this. Great photographs, I should say, by the way, they're all taken by Matt Simon right here, my research associate. Now, if the snake comes out like that and he's in the rocks, fine, you see them in the open, that's okay. But are you going to see them like that very often in the rocks on the den in the early spring? Well, maybe not. One of the problems is heat. It gets too hot for them. Here's a little sketch from my field notes showing a rattlesnake basically partly out in the open, but also partly under in the shaded area. And so they have to be very careful this way. Now, the problem is that they, being ectotherms, they depend on the environment for their body temperature. Now, there's mechanisms for heat gain and heat loss there, you see. If you're a physicist, you'll like those particular diagrams. Let's just call it heat gain and heat loss. If they're out in the open, they might tend to be, let's say, 86. Well, that's just about right, but it's getting close to being too hot. They can cool off by going under shelter boulders. You notice a 30-degree less temperature in that condition, or they could go underground in a burrow, or they might swim, or they might be in the shade of a tree. So they have to be very careful not to overheat. That's a big problem. One of the main myths about rattlesnakes in general by the public is that they like to come out in hot sun, which they do not do. Believe me, they don't do that. Now, they might do that a little but they have to be very cautious. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. The photograph there, you see that rattlesnake. Basically, you can see the shaded area around it. So it's pretty much in the shade there, protruding a little bit. And in the lower section, you see a little more of that snake with a little bit more of it in the sun, but not much in the sun. And probably that's enough. And everything else is fully shaded. And if it gets too hot, they go back in. They just are pretty vulnerable to heat. And here's an example of one that's finally, it's in the shaded forest. What a relief, being in the shaded forest. In total shade, along a trail. This was taken, photograph was taken by one of our colleagues on a hike where the snake is just right out there in the open on a log. No problem there because it's fairly cool. Or they may use shelter boulders. We have a number of shelter boulders that we've identified that the snakes will use year out, year after year after year. The same predictable locations are often used regularly every year. Not necessarily the same individual, but sometimes the same one, sometimes different ones. And at higher elevations, this being a rattlesnake would right next to a shelter boulder, at a high elevation where you see low bush blueberry, covers of lichens and so forth. This was right around 2,000 foot elevation here. And making babies, that's an important aspect of their life history. Here what we see are a couple of blended females coiled out together, and again, these pregnant females are often associated with one another in gregarious groups like this. Here's a photograph of a little aggregation of gravid, we call them gravid, we call them pregnant. A few there, a few down in there, you see in the rocks. So 5 or 6 different females here in this situation, all pregnant during the middle of the summer. Now, this was a situation I encountered one time out of many hundreds, if not thousands of situations. These 2 females were out in the open on a cloudy, damp day, which was perfect for them. Totally asleep, sound asleep. And you can see, look at their heads, totally angled at a sharp angle. They're touching each other. They're very, in fact, they were so oblivious to me. I just to test them, I stepped right over them, and they didn't move. When I stepped back over the other, then they woke up and began getting a little aroused and a little nervous. So I abandoned the process, which I do in the field, and let them go, mark them, and let them go. They may have already been marked. I could forget that, whether they were or not, but there's a good example of taking a nap. I like to do that too. Now, live-bearing timber rattlesnakes were all rattlesnakes. The ovary has a bunch of small oocytes in there. Once they ovulate, of course, then they go into the oviduct. You can call them eggs if you like, but they're really not eggs. They're just oocytes with membranes. To be a legitimate egg, you have to be enclosed in several different internal membranes plus an external shell, like a bird's egg, chicken egg. That's an egg. But these aren't eggs, although most people call them eggs. Then there's an early embryo and some placental membranes around the early embryo as they develop. Of course, the gestation period is all summer. They ovulate in early June, late May, early June. So they gestate from June, July, and August, and then they give birth in September. So they basically have a 3-month gestation period. Then the babies are born, and they are surrounded by the early membranes that they break out of. There might be a little remnant yolk sac attached to them that they resorb pretty quickly. Here's a photograph Matt took of a female with a litter of babies, a litter of newborns. You can see several right here. Several of them coiled right in mommy's coils there. And yeah, the females will stay with the babies for a week to 10 days. until the babies shed their skin, which is another aspect of their biology I want to touch on here. But there's a very close association of the female and the young here for the first week, 10 days after the babies are born. And this brings up the rattle. This is a photograph of some lab babies. You notice the tail tip there has a skin cap on. Not a full rattle yet. This is called a pre-button. It's actually just a epidermal cap over the tail tip. And what happens is pre-button on early proto-rattle of a baby is then eliminated by shedding. Here you see a baby at about an age of 8 to 10 days of age, shedding its skin, first shedding of its life. Now, once the baby sheds its skin from the pre-button, then it develops, there develops underneath it, or doesn't develop, or it's sitting under there called a button. And the button is what the baby then has right after it has shed. And that's the very first segment of the forming rattle. And of course, this is a skin structure. It's just like keratin of your fingernails. That's what the rattle is. It's an epidermal skin structure. Now, here's a photograph of a yearling. And you'll notice at the arrow is the button. Now, I think it has another segment next to the button. It may have shed once again, but there you can clearly see the button on that one-year-old, what do you call it, neonate? I guess it's youngster. Now, as they grow and shed after they've been born, they shed once, twice, 3, 4, 5. Their rattle continues to accumulate new segments as they go. When we have a 5-segment rattle like that, if we knew the rate of addition of those segments, which we have measured, we could then age snake. And I can tell you right now that a 5-segment, what we call a complete rattle, that is, it has the button still on it, hasn't broken yet, would be about a 3-year-old snake. And it could be anywhere between 5 and 2 or 3, but basically a 5-segment rattle would be about a 3-year-old snake. Now, what happens, of course, with the skin being shed is you have a whole new generation growing underneath here, and a generation that is shed, and the new generation underneath takes its place. So essentially, this is a periodic phenomenon where the epidermis is just completely cast off. All squamates, which are lizards and snakes, all 7,000 species worldwide of all lizards and snakes do this. They shed in one piece, periodic, one whole piece, not little bits and pieces like mammals and birds do. Now, here's a snake getting ready to shed, and what happens here, we call these pre-shed cloudy. You notice the eyes, they're cloudy, milky, and the whole calf of the skin is cloudy, which is a layer of fluids between those two layers of 2 generations of the skin, of the epidermis. And what happens is the snake loosens the old skin from around its head, begins to push up against things, and then it moves away from the skin, which goes inside out towards the rear of the snake as it goes forward. And finally, it moves away from the shed skin, which essentially now faces in the opposite direction from the snake crawling away from its old skin. So those are the actual movements of the snake when it gets out of that skin. And here's an example of a shed skin that's in the field we find periodically. And I should mention here that our marking technique allows us to identify any recaptured snake or a marked snake by just looking at the skin where the mark occurs on. I could go into further details on that if you'd like, but for now, that's the shed skin. And here's what happens. Rattle formation begins right here, over the head. The skin begins to come off. And as you notice here, even the eye caps come off because these animals do not have any movable eyelids. They have a permanent epidermal clear, we call a spectacle, or in German, grill, really, over the cornea. And there's a cornea underneath. So this is the new eye cap right there, and underneath that would be the cornea. Cornea is your outer layer of the eye. Once they start shedding, let's say we have a 5-segment rattle over there on the left. Skin gets pulled back, the skin comes off, shed skin comes off, and revealed underneath is a new basal segment right there. Now the rattle is not a 5-segment rattle, it's a 6-segment rattle. Counting the basal and all the other segments. And of course, this is just a typical example of how the rattle increases in size as the snake sheds its skin. What does the rattle do? Here's an upset timber rattlesnake with its tail raised and its tail vibrating, normal temperatures of about 50 to 60 cycles a second. Now, when you have 8 or 9 of these loosely fitting dried segments clicking together in several different spots against each other, maybe dozens and dozens of contact points, what you produce is an external sound of about 6,000 hertz, which is way above the snake's own hearing ability. Their hearing ability ranges from about 400 hertz to maybe 800 hertz, very low. Low either cycles per second hertz. So the animal cannot hear its own rattle sound. Now, to a human, the sound sort of sounds like a hissing noise, like a boiler hissing, or let's say a garden hose spraying water, something like that. It's a pretty startling sound. And basically, most biologists now believe that the function of the rattle is as a deterrent, as a protective defensive mode by scaring away typically a would-be predator. Now, how do they make a living? Well, they make a living by ambushing their prey. Here you see a picture of a timber rattlesnake float against a log with a mouse approaching on that log. So they use their eyes, they have excellent vision. They can hear, as I mentioned, low frequency sounds through their inner ear, although they do not have any external auditory meatus. They don't have any, I can used to tell my students, look, when you're describing the external auditory meatus, I would say, do not say ear hole. If you say ear hole on my exam, you're getting an F. You say external auditory meatus, that's too hard for you to learn? No, you can do that. Anyway, these animals do not have an ear hole. And so a lot of biologists would wonder, don't have ear, then they hear. They have everything else in them. They have the cochlear duct, they have a connection of bones, not through airborne sounds, but primarily through substrate vibratory sounds transmitted to the normal auditory cochlear cells that are in an inner ear and allow them to hear. But as I mentioned, their hearing capacity is at a low frequency, like 400 to 800 hertz. Now, the other thing they can do through their pit is they have an infrared heat detector. So the mouse is basically doomed. Here's one Matt photographed, a beautiful photograph of one coiled right against the log. And there he is. Now, he's just ambushed. You might stay there in a coiled ambush position for a day, 24 hours or more before he gets lucky and has the chipmunk or the mouse going along that log. But he's ready. He's ready to get his meal. So basically, they're small mammal predators. Here you see this is a photograph of a rattlesnake in captivity, feeding on a white-footed mouse. And snakes are affected by annual variations in populations of their prey. There are good years and bad years. Sometimes they starve, sometimes they have a good year. But their total energy intake can affect these characteristics, reproduction and survival. Of course, the greater the prey densities are, and the luckier they are, the better they do for their energetics. What they eat is squirrels, mice, and voles. Here what you see is a gray squirrel, a red squirrel, chipmunk. If you like scientific names, you've got Sciurus and Canius, but in the middle you've got Canius sciurus for the red squirrel. And then in mice and voles, you have a white-footed mouse, red-backed vole, and a meadow vole. They love voles. They love them. So you get into a grassy meadow where there's lots of voles, and they go crazy. They get a lot of easy meals out. That's what they eat. Now, there are other things recorded in their diet in other areas other than up here in the Northeast, the mammals. For example, they do eat birds occasionally. They eat ground-dwelling birds like juncos or other birds on the ground pretty much. They can climb, but they don't climb very often. They've even been recorded to feed on frogs occasionally and lizards in other areas, but primarily they're mammal predators. Now here's one. This is not from our area here. This is from the Hudson Highlands in Ulster County. Now, this is a large male timber rattlesnake feeding on a gray squirrel. Now, gray squirrels are almost out of range of the size of our snakes here. I think the very largest males we have here might or would be able to feed on a gray squirrel. But in our study area, gray squirrels are pretty rare. They're uncommon. And so they usually don't eat them, but they can. Imagine that for a nice Thanksgiving dinner. Mm-hmm. Hard to imagine. Now, they are part of an ecosystem or community. So there are other animals out there that are going to take timber rattlesnakes for their own, such as coyotes, bobcats, great horned owl, and red-tailed hawk. The two in the middle, the wild turkey and the racer, pretty much prey on babies or small yearling 2-year-old timber rattlesnakes. They usually can't cope with a large adult like that, whereas the other predators can usually do that. Now, here's evidence of predation. What we have here are the skeletal remains of a timber rattlesnake that had been taken by red-tailed hawk. In fact, this photograph shows the pellet of the bird right there, the regurgitated pellet that did contain scales, timber rattlesnake scales, not the bones. Those are all digestible. You can break if you're a bird of prey, your gastric situation allows you to break down bones, but not keratin, not skin products like scales. Those come out in the fecal material or in the pellet, the regurgitated pellet. Now, parental care, as I mentioned, in a neat volume a few years ago, Vertebrate Life, the mother remains at the natal site until the young have shed for the first time. Here's a neat photograph taken by Matt with the female and her newborns. And all these babies haven't shed yet, so they're right with mommy in the birth cradles. Now, he had an automatic trail camera set up and was able to photograph one of the potential predators to the rattlesnake. That's a gray fox. And suppose the gray fox may have known, but back there in the square is the place in the crevice where the mother and babies were. So maybe the fox wasn't able to locate them, but he certainly might have tried. Here's a baby coiled out in the leaves, basically, when they're working their way, moving back towards the den, which they have to do after they're born. They're somewhat vulnerable at that particular point. But also in Vertebrate Life, it's pointed out, and these are scientific results here. Juveniles continue to associate with their mothers and siblings or with close relatives after they disperse. They do this when they're 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, when they're young, probably not yet sexually mature. But they basically are very able to recognize their own kin and their own relatives, and they do stay together. As I mentioned, we published this situation here with a lifespan record lifespan, based on the one snake. We had others, we had several others. We had dozens of other rattlesnakes that we put in the same publication. They were in their 30s and 40s. We had a male that was 41 years old, and now we've got that same snake that's reached mid-40s. Now, with life history summary, then they first reproduce at an age, these are females, at a 9 or 10-year age for females. Well, it takes them almost a decade to reach maturity. Their birthing frequency is triennial 3 years, 4 years, maybe even 5 years between births. Their litter size averages about 8. We get litters ranging from 3 or 4 up to 10 or 12 sometimes, but the average is about 8. First year juveniles survive at only a 50 to 60% rate in the first year, but after that, when they reach beyond the second year and going forward, they survive at a rate of about 90% per year. So they have a very high adult survival. And their longevity, again, is greater than 40 years maximum. Now, what about nuisance rattlesnakes? Well, a good definition came out a few years ago. A snake having the audacity to show up in an area where humans don't want it, thereby obligating its removal. When we run into this, here's a rattlesnake photograph, actually photographed in Massachusetts, coming out of a hole in a barn. This was in a barn near a house. Now, on Lake George, rattlesnakes do make island visits. They can swim. Many of you know. They'll swim out to some of the islands. We have records from about 24 islands now that get maybe a rattlesnake or two every several years. Now, so they can swim. This was photographed right here by Matt, one of our snakes swimming out there. This is it. This was photographed. This was an adult male photographed at a campsite on an island. And a couple of things to note here. First, the rattlesnake is a marked animal. You notice the little blue on the rattle there? That's our temporary mark, paint mark. We mark the rattles with. So that's a marked animal. Secondly, the photographer got pretty close. He was a shadow right here. So he was just standing right next to the snake, basically. And the snake has a prominent bulge right there in the middle, showing a meal that just finished, probably a red squirrel. They love chipmunks and red squirrels, and mice too. They'll eat those. They get a lot of those out around the campsite. Now, this is one of the rangers, Kathleen, a couple of years ago, showing how the DEC, when the campers call up with their cell phones and they congregate around the rattlesnake, not allowing the rattlesnake to go. That means just there and people surround it. And they're on these little devices we call cell phones. Don't get me started on that. Anyway, he's just capturing the rattlesnake there and he puts it in the garbage can and goes away. Big deal. And then she brings it back to our pickup point. We take the snake and mark it, or if it's already marked, we release it pretty much back where we know it came from. So it's a pretty routine operation now. But one of the snakes in the early years we called Champ. And these rangers here are holding Champ up there. 10 years in a row, we had records of Champ constantly going out to Turtle Island. And it's called a repeat offender. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. And so, finally, we dealt with Champ for a number of years. So finally, he crashed, I guess. But he was in our record books for quite a while. Now, this is making a home visit. Now, if you have a deck and a grill and you have a little picnic area and stuff, you probably wouldn't want to have a couple of rattlesnakes approaching there on your deck near your grill. So what you do is you call up or you handle it yourself, you deal it with yourself, you know how to do it. Here's the same situation where these two snakes, one a female, one a male. The male's after the female. Potential mating pair in August at this home, this house. Fortunately, this is one of our great friends and cooperators, Richard Watkins, who knows very well how to be catching snakes for decades and turning him over to us. We're a good cooperator. Here's a situation where a small office building, an outbuilding, maybe an office visit. This was a converted tool shed. It was a beautiful little office. Had a skylight, a computer, bulletin board, file cabinets, a desk, chair, and everything in there. And then one time, rattlesnake came in there and upset the owner. And the owner, when he saw the rattlesnake crawling around on his computer printer, didn't give him much confidence. Anyway, when he became aware of the snake, which he did after he heard it hissing, he thought it was the hose. He thought it was the neighbor's hose out there. The rattlesnake was just rattling off the lawn, and when he realized it was right next to him on the floor in the deck, he bolted the door and slammed the door shut. And when I got there, this was taken by one of his buddies before I actually got there. He opened the door and photographed the snake. The easiest snake I ever had to do, all I had to do was open the door and there it was. But of course, if you were the office man, you're very pleased to that happened. That was one of the weirder nuisance snakes I've encountered. Over the years, the 40-year history here, we've gotten over 400, well over 400 nuisance snakes. There you can see Champ. Basically, there's been an increase, but in recent years, there's usually around a dozen, maybe 15. This was 1994 when we had, I think, 30 some nuisance calls, but basically they've increased. This doesn't mean the population is increasing. It just means more and more people are becoming aware of them, making calls to get somebody to come out and get them, which the DC Rangers are pretty well trained to do. So, you know, it's not a lot of snakes. As I mentioned, there are about 24 islands plus private camps that they go to. When all of these records are accumulated, that's basically the trend. You see, there's a lot of variation, a lot of fluctuation from one year to the next. And it's pretty typical of any set of biological data you might get. There's a lot of variation. So what do you do when you're hiking? How do you prepare and what do you do? Well, first of all, you be prepared because you know the rattlesnakes are in the area. So there are a couple of things you can do to avoid getting into trouble. This is a well-prepared group. One time you showed this slide, the person said to me, "Hey, how come you're the guy over here wearing boots and leggings against snake bite? Everybody else is wearing shorts and sneakers, and you're in rattlesnake habitat. What's the matter with you?" Well, of course, they don't have to step on the snake gently to hold it underfoot and process it, do all that kind of stuff. All they have to do is follow directions. You're all right. And of course, this is a group of my colleagues gathered. Of course, if you see a timber rattlesnake, you immediately gravitate to it, and everybody rushes up and tries to get a picture. And there's the snake in the yellow there, in case you didn't see it. But here's a close-up, and the way you get good close-ups is something like that. And snakes aren't aggressive; they just sit there. A timber rattlesnake. This was published in 1944 by Breckenridge in Minnesota. He was a pretty good biologist. And he said the timber rattlesnake does not have a vicious disposition. It first tries to avoid notice by lying still, like this was doing. But if seen, it attempts to escape to the nearest crevice. Well, of course, in this situation, the snake had no chance to escape because he was surrounded by people. Now, another early description of their behavior was in 1941 by Schmidt and Davis, Field Book of Snakes in the U.S. and Canada. My mother got me this book when I was 12, I think. And I can't tell you what a great book it is. So anyway, it's a small volume, 1941. And they said the timber rattlesnake will often stand its ground if cornered. And that's correct also. They will do. Now, if you see a timber rattlesnake like that, coiled in a position where it can strike, it's all inflated, it looks big, it's rattling like mad. Of course, you're not going to go right up to it because it's defending itself. So they will do. Now, what they do is they puff up. I don't know what they call it, puffing up. On the left, you see a timber rattlesnake all inflated. Now they inflate with a so-called saccular lung. They have a regular lung, the vascular lung, for blood gas transfer, oxygen, CO2 transfer, just anterior to the heart. But posterior to the heart, they have a saccular lung, which can also be inflated. In other words, they can inhale and inflate that part of their lung. We don't have that, but they certainly do. Of course, they do not have a diaphragm. They don't have that. That only appears in mammals. Now, this one is raised up, inflated, and ready to defend itself. So they basically make themselves look twice as big as they really are by ventilary inflation. So an encounter on a hiking trail might look like this. And what do you do to see one like that? Well, you stop and take a photograph and try to maneuver around the snakes to get a better picture. And then watch the snake dash off into the weeds, and you're done. Now, I have in my field notes one time where I said, as I walk close to him, he raises his head in a curious observant mode, just like a periscope, like this. So I said, okay, what's going to happen if I walk right up next to him? He extends his forepaw, tongue flicking my boot and leggings. He was just curious. He wanted to see what the heck this was. Another kind of an encounter on a trail. Now, if you're on a trail, you want to watch for the signs up, the trail signs up there, right? You don't worry about anything else except what do you see here? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Looking at the base of the tree. Looking at the base of the tree over here. Right around there. And all of a sudden, you have a rattlesnake over there. But if you're on the trail, you just avoid it, and you just go on watching the trail markers and ignoring everything else. Now, so let's consider what happens. The snake's behavior, your behavior, and venomation, the chance of being bitten. What about those three aspects in creating a warning sign that is accurate and good for people to understand? Okay, first of all, a rattlesnake is vicious and will attack. Run like hell. Rattle, rock, and dash it. The rattlesnake bite will kill you within minutes. Oh. But all of those are inaccurate or misleading or just plain wrong. Because here's the real situation. Here's some things you need to remember. Timber rattlesnakes are not aggressive and usually attempt to escape. Your behavior. Do not approach or molest a rattlesnake. Don't do that. If you see one, stay away from it. Stay about 4 or 5 feet away. You're all right. Envenomation. Timber rattlesnake bite is a serious medical emergency, but is rarely fatal. Rarely fatal. It doesn't say never fatal. Because one of my 2 colleagues who passed away in 2022, Martin, was bitten and killed by a timber rattlesnake. That's how he died. If bitten, go to the nearest hospital without delay. You heard the Boy Scout stuff on first aid for state by kid and everything over the years. None of it works in. In fact, the world's best physician on rattlesnake bites, Finley Russell, famously said one day when he was asked, "What do you do about a rattlesnake?" He says, "Okay, you haven't forgotten your car keys. You haven't done anything wrong." That's what he said. Now, this prompted the DEC very recently, and these are posted at the trailheads now. Deer Leaf Clay Meadow and Montcalm Point, where all of these rules are put into effect on this trail warning sign at the trail registry. But don't go near the snake and all the other things that I just showed you. Now, I want to close with this, or get close to closing here. I'm sure you're relieved about that. Matt Simon, my main associate now, wrote to me back in 2009 when he encountered this situation. Let me see if I can read that. The first time I ever got to see them in their natural habitat, I was about 35 minutes into a hike, and out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a black jacket that someone had left on a rock. I quickly realized that it was a pile of rattlesnakes. I took some pictures and continued hiking, and on my way back about a half an hour later, they were still there. I always try to stay as close to the trail as possible and avoid their delicate habitat. Now, when I read that and had some other conversations with Matt, it quickly occurred to me that, hey, that's the best job application I could get. From that point on, he became my associate once we met. Believe me, that was right there. The best thing he could have done as a job application. Now, here's another situation from my own field notes one day, hiking on the trail. I didn't see her as I walked past and heard a strange sound that I immediately thought was highway traffic of a distant passing car on the highway far below. But then I saw a snake stretch out and inflated. She had just inhaled and produced a whooshing sound. And I realized it was her hissing, not the car, but her hissing. I've heard this several times over the years, not often, but they essentially inhale, they go, like they give a rapid, pulling the air into their lungs. They don't exhale, they inhale. And that creates a vibratory hissing sound in their throat. And they do this periodically, or they can do this when they're really threatened. When there's a huge human around, they may do that. But in 1983, of course, this was listed in New York State as a threatened species. And now it's illegal to do much with them without a permit. This is a photograph 75 years ago, when the rangers probably would have killed any rattlesnake they saw on site, just as a matter of course. Whereas last year and today, and again this year, where we had training demos, the rangers, the ECOs, the forest rangers, the lake rangers, they're all aware of the snakes. They want to protect them. They want to get them. They want to capture them if they're nuisance snakes. They're trained to do this. So it's a tremendous change in attitude and perception, both in the public arena and in the official state agency situation. I'd like to end with Bill Burkhead, my close childhood friend. Here he is basically handling a Western diamondback rattlesnake when we were employed at the New York Serpentarium, which was a tourist attraction in the Adirondacks in the early 1960s. But this is a photograph of his son Roger and his granddaughter of Bill and Faith Burkhead, where Roger, being a biologist, he grew up with a biologist father, and he was certainly aware that this is a timber rattlesnake that he captured, lives in Alabama, near Auburn. And a neighbor of his in the adjoining yard found this huge, and that's a timber rattlesnake. You don't see that big around here, but in the South you do. So the neighbor said, he said, Roger says, come on over, I got something for you. Roger goes over, catches the snake. And now what he does, and this is done by a lot of venomous snake researchers, I don't do it, but a lot of people do. They tube the snake in a clear plastic, oh, that's good. A clear plastic tube. Before it kind of coats it to go in there. Now, when it gets in the plastic tube, you can hold it there. And the rest of it you can, work with if you're going to process it and do whatever you want to do with it. But so it's a safe way of dealing with it. Uh-oh.
Double click on the center again.
Okay, if you escape, it might take you out to the.
Well, this is the end anyway. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, that's the end. Thank you very much. And I'll bring questions if yes,
I have a question for you. I read a lot about reptiles. It's like my dreams are under a serpentarium, similar to what you were talking about that used to be here. I've seen recently being discussed timbers and cane breaks, if they're because they're technically right now considered the same. There's a bunch of people saying that they're thinking that they're going to be broken into a subspecies, the cane break from the timber. What do you think about that?
let's go up here.
That's a southern, that would be
That's a cane.
cane break, yeah.
Well, they were initially described as two different subspecies. Northern timbers, southern cane breaks. But in about 1973, this was studied more closely, and they were synonymous, and the southern cane break subspecies reduced to
Okay.
oblivion.
Yeah.
Scientifically, no more. So it's all one species, highly variable throughout the whole range, 30 states.
So the variable, because I've seen a lot of people say they notice more like pinkish down the back of their
Yeah.
saddles down south, less up here, more black days up here,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
That's right.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's all one species now, Crotalus harvest, there's no more Crotalus harvest, Acrocondatus and Kilmate.
Yeah.
And harvest, they're all the same, one highly variable species, but that's a good.
Yeah, and what about the Massasauga rattlesnakes, if they're moving their way out here or not? I've also heard that was a debate as well. Of course, in like Facebook groups, not amongst professional.
No, Massasauga, at least in New York State, are, anyway, Massasauga is a relatively small, no more than about 2 feet total length, swamp rattlesnake. It's in a different genus from the normal Crotalus. It's in Cistrurus, genus Cistrurus. But anyway, they're found in 2 western New York wetlands only. They're restricted to those 2 wetlands. One near Syracuse and one near farther west, more towards Rochester, just those 2. But as a species, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
They're not expanding their range. They're totally restricted and reduced, and they're usually listed in most states as either threatened or endangered. New York, for instance, is endangered. Timbers are listed as threatened in New York. Now, it's interesting you brought up Massasaugas because although they're small, they used to be very abundant in the state of Michigan, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio. In other words, they're in the upper Midwest, in wetland or grassy areas. But I'm just going to take Michigan. In Michigan in the 19th century, there were approximately 150 known fatalities to people just from Massasauga bites alone. Now, Michigan never had, presumably, any timbers. So these were all Massasauga bites, all causing death, a large number of deaths. And today we recognize the venom of the Massasauga to be much more potent than the venom of the timber, much more potent. Now, of course, you don't get very many snake bite deaths today in the United States, maybe about half a dozen a year, from all species of snakes, anywhere between maybe 6 and 10 per year.
And most of those are hobbyists.
Pardon?
And most of those are hobbyists.
A lot of them are, just whatever the case may be. But primarily because of modern age and entry, of course, in the 19th century in Michigan, a farm field near a wetland was a good place for a Massasauga, and if you're walking around in bare feet or something like that, you got bitten.
Yes.
You're ain't even your chances of survival were not good, really weren't. So I just wanted to point that out. Those facts were revealed to me by one of our historical researchers who's been doing a lot of work on that particular species. Of course, it's not just Michigan, it's Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and other areas where Massasaugas occur.
The Massasauga is fascinating because, like you said, they're the Cistrurus, which is like the pygmy rattlesnake too, as well, right? They're just like their own little thing. It's really cool.
Pygmy rattlesnakes of southeast Florida primarily. These are small snakes, about 15 to 18 inches long total length in adults. Yeah,
Really?
but they're they're venomous and they're nothing to play around with.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Just want to say.
Is it true that the juveniles
inject more venom because they don't know how much to release than a mature snake?
Well,
I heard that when I was out hiking out west.
that is a common belief, but I'll classify it as a myth.
Okay.
First of all, a baby or juvenile being smaller has far less volume of venom than an adult is logical. It doesn't know how to, well, most rattlesnakes we believe can meter the venom a certain way. They have skeletal muscles surrounding venom glands, so they have control of it. These are not just involuntary smooth muscles. These are striated, what we call striated skeletal muscles that control the venom gland, allowing the snake to inject a certain amount of venom if it wants to or not. But young, small rattlesnakes, no, they do not have, and they're not more venomous. Their venom is not more toxic. That's another part of that belief. But thanks for asking. That's a good question because that does come up quite a lot. Yes.
So. How far does the snakes actually wander from their den?
That's a good question. Typically, a few hundred meters, there are many of them. This is moving from the den to their summer range. Oftentimes they move anywhere up to 1.5 miles. The maximum is about 3 to 4 miles, which is a considerably long movement when you think about it, going from the den in these mountains 3 miles away. Yeah, that's a heck of a movement. And of course, the reverse movement coming back in the fall means that they have to do the same thing to get back to the den in time to go in to avoid the cold weather.
So the snakes that you like pick up on the island or in the immediate area, probably 2 to 3 miles from the den already?
Well, it depends on where their den is, but no, they're
How
not.
do you know to return them? How do you know where their den is to take them?
Because well, in some cases we assume that where they came from was pretty much directly across from the island they came from. For example, if they came from St. Sacrament, we'd release them across there. Up near Deer Leap, if they came from Turtle or something, then they're down in the south sector. So, but oftentimes they're marks and you know exactly what den they came from. Because they're marked and we have a record. So we basically take them back where we know they won't get lost.
So when you take them back, do you mark them then? So.
Oh, yeah, if they're not marked, we always mark our snakes. Every snake gets marked.
And
Everyone.
do they ever lose the rattle?
Oh, yeah, they got that in the slide, but I don't know if I can get it.
That's okay.
With the system. But anyway. Occasionally we've got 3 or 4 records over the years of a stubtail rattlesnake. In other words, it lost the tip of its tail.
There's a picture of one actually, because you said how old it was and we thought, oh, he doesn't look like he has any rattles. So they do have that little.
On the juvenile. But I mean, I'm talking about injury where the tail gets amputated in front of it. So that the tail tip and the rattle all get lost. Then the tail repairs and regenerates itself, but it never grow any rattle because it'll be a permanent stub tail. But the snake, if it gets excited, it might vibrate the tail, maybe no sense.
I actually have the privilege of taking care of my grandson's corn snake when he's away. I have to feed him. And I noticed they even like, move their tail.
Correct.
It must be an inherent thing.
Yeah.
We got my tail or maybe.
Black rat snakes vibrate their tail, milk snakes vibrate their tail, some variety. So this is a built-in muscular behavioral response in numbers. And so when people say, "Oh, I've got a rattlesnake in my basement" or something like that, usually it's a milk snake. This is in and around the foundation.
Sometimes.
You know, or a black rat snake. And I always tell them, wait a minute, you've got a rattling snake.
I have
Yes.
a question, please. How many timber rattlesnakes would you say are in the Adirondack Park and the Bolton area?
How many? Well, enough.
Yes,
As a threatened species, we don't usually go into details like that in public forum, but, you know, I mean, these snakes are, as I mentioned, because of the limitations of their life history, low reproductive rate, long life, they will not expand greatly. We have found that. As a matter of fact, we have a current modeling team now looking at the life history in detail, mathematically. Models that are causing us to look at projections of these snakes over the next few decades. What we've already found is the survival rates declining a little bit over the years. And we found impacts of climate change that are going to cause further exacerbation of this trend. And we've also found shifts in the color morph ratios, yellow-black ratio. But anyway, these are more or less technical details that most of you probably won't worry about. But in general, we have a sufficient population of snakes to keep me busy over 40 years.
There's a number of.
I'll just leave it at that.
but
Yes.
they're still considered endangered.
They are threatened, yes. They're not listed as endangered threatened in every state, but all the New England states do protect them. Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota. All these states protect timber rattlesnakes as part of their natural wildlife. So, I mean, they are, they're getting more attention.
Okay, thank you. One more question, please. Is Tongue Mountain on Lake George heavily populated with timber rattlesnakes?
Say that again, please.
I'll speak a little slower. Is Tongue Mountain on Lake George heavily populated with timber rattlesnakes?
The mountain range is populated with timber rattlesnakes. I wouldn't describe it as heavily. It is populated with, yes, that's part of their natural range in our area. Okay.
But
So
but
it's-
no more than other areas.
It depends on what you mean by other area. No.
Well,
typically not.
other areas in the Adirondack Park. Tongue Mountain is probably has the same population as other areas in the Adirondack Park, correct?
Yes.
Just a minute.